Support for this podcast comes from the law firm of Davis Malm. Whether you're a developer, property owner, manager, or commercial tenant, their real estate attorneys know the lay of the land, not just the law. Learn more at davismalm.com.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Darryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. WBUR Senior Climate and Environment Reporter Miriam Wasser. Welcome back to The Common.
Hey, Darryl. Thanks for having me back.
Yes. Thank you for coming through. So, Miriam, you have a story for us today about how experts believe that many states, including Massachusetts, are undercounting heat-related deaths. And in your story, you introduced us to a doctor who told you about a patient whose death was potentially heat-related. Tell us about her.
Sure. So for my story, I spoke with an emergency department physician named Dr. Hillary Irons, and she works at UMass Memorial Hospital. And she told me a story about a patient that she treated several years ago who came in the middle of a heat wave.
When she was brought into the emergency department, she had an elevated temperature of 102 degrees Fahrenheit.
This woman also had a really elevated pulse. She had a really dry mouth, which is an indication that she was severely dehydrated, and she was completely unresponsive. So the woman was accompanied by her son, and they lived together in an apartment that had an air conditioning unit but was broken. And the son had said when he left for work that morning, his mom seemed fine. And then when he got home that evening, she was laying on the bed, unresponsive. In the emergency department, they tried giving the woman fluids. They tried cooling her body, but her kidneys started to fail. And at that point, the family decided to implement comfort measures. So the woman died in the hospital a couple hours later. And the reason I tell this story is that if you look at this woman's death certificate, the cause of death is kidney failure. But the question is, what role, if any, did heat play? And is this a heat death, and should it be counted as such? So, I asked Dr. Hillary Irons this directly.
It's hard to say for sure, but had it not been such a hot and humid day, she might have survived.
Right. So I think it's important for us to differentiate between heat-caused deaths and heat-related deaths.
Yes, please, break it down.
Yeah, and to be clear, there is no official definition of either of these terms, so I just kind of came up with terms for my story so we're being consistent. I'm using the term heat-caused death to be an instance where someone dies directly from the heat. So we have an athlete who's exercising outside on a 105-degree day and collapses. We know that the heat caused that death. Or a construction worker who develops heat stroke also on a really hot day and dies. Those are heat-caused deaths. Those are instances where if you were to look at the death certificate, the cause of death would be heat. Far more common is what I'm calling a heat-related death. Those are instances where heat is maybe a secondary or a contributing factor. So like this woman in the ER.
Okay, so the woman in the ER who you just told us about, her death could be considered a heat-related death, right? And that's just one example. Why should we be concerned about these type of deaths not being counted?
Yeah, well, so let me just back up really quick and say that, yes, we might call her death a heat-related death, but there is no national standard for what a heat-related death is. There's no list, no diagnostic criteria listed anywhere for when you put heat as a secondary cause of death. And as a result, any data we have about it is by definition incomplete or sort of a patchwork. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And why is that an issue?
Right. So it's an issue, I'd say, for two very related reasons. The first is climate change. So we know that climate change is making heat waves longer, more intense, more frequent. And so we can pretty much say that more people are going to go to the hospital because of heat every summer, and more people are going to die from heat as the climate continues to warm. The second reason that this is important to track is that cities, states, community groups are doing a lot to try to combat the heat. there is a growing awareness that heat is really deadly and it is a very severe issue and that we need interventions. But some public health experts that I spoke to said, if we're not measuring how many people die from heat, it's really hard to know if any of these interventions are working. And just to give you an example, one of the people I spoke to for this story was Francesca Dominici. She's at Harvard University.
This information is absolutely crucial to understand whether or not specific public health intervention that could be effective.
Got it. I want to backtrack a little bit, Miriam. How did you come to this story?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so before I worked at WBUR, I was a reporter in Phoenix, Arizona for a couple of years. And as we know, Phoenix is a very, very hot place.
Mm-hmm.
And so Phoenix is in Maricopa County. And Maricopa County has a pretty robust heat illness and heat death tracking system. And so I was used to getting weekly reports during the summer about how many people died directly from the heat or indirectly from the heat, how many people went to the hospital. And so when I started here, I remember it was a couple summers ago during a particularly bad heat wave. And I thought, oh, you know what? I want to include that information in my story. And so I asked a colleague, where can I find this information on the state website? And they said, I don't think we have that. And sure enough, while we do have information about who goes to the hospital for heat, we're not really tracking heat deaths in any systematic way. And so this had been a question that I had for a couple of years, why are we not doing this? And I finally got a chance to answer it this summer.
So what data on heat-related deaths do we have?
I would say it's a patchwork across the country. In terms of Massachusetts and other New England states, I reached out to the health departments of all 6 states, and they were all able to pull data for me about the number of heat-caused deaths over the last decade or so. And there are really only a handful every year. Some were able to pull numbers about heat-related deaths. And again, there's no standard for when that happens. So those numbers it's hard to say anything about them. There's no systematic tracking in New England and really across the country.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we are back with more from Miriam. Some experts say it's hard to quantify or track this type of data. But you mentioned Phoenix and Maricopa County, right? Is there anywhere else doing this successfully?
Yeah, there are a couple places around the country that are tracking heat-related deaths. And I would say that really there are 2 methods for doing this, 2 emerging methods. One is to do what Maricopa County does, which is to tally up the number of death certificates where heat is listed as a secondary cause of death, and that's your number. The other method is something that New York City is doing, where they're looking at excess deaths. So they're using statistical models to say, on a given 3-day heat wave, let's say, how many extra people do we think died than would have died had it not been a heat wave, right? And there's all sorts of factors that go into this. And you might be familiar with this term because it got used a lot during COVID when people talk about excess deaths to try to quantify how many people died. So there is debate in the public health world about which method is superior or more accurate or going to get you a more kind of geographically specific information that you might want. But those are the two methods. And pretty much everyone I talked to agreed doing one of them consistently is better than what we have right now.
Yeah. Well, why don't we have numbers on heat-related deaths here in Massachusetts?
That is a great question. And I want to play you a cut from one expert I talked to, Eric Kleinenberg. He's a sociologist at NYU who focuses on cities and climate change and does a lot of work on heat. Mm-hmm. So I asked him that, and this is what he told me.
States like Massachusetts don't track heat deaths because they don't have to, and because no one has really fought for them to do it.
Yeah, so one of the things that he talks about a lot is a growing awareness that heat is an issue and is a really deadly problem. But also, states like Massachusetts might track heat-related deaths if people at the CDC told them to do it, right? There's no national standard for how to do this, and so we don't have to do it. And so a lot of states don't.
So, Miriam, is the fact that the state does not collect data on heat-related deaths an equity issue?
Absolutely. We know that the people who are more likely to die from heat are going to be older. They're going to have more chronic health conditions. They are going to be poorer, and they're more likely to be unhoused. Mm-hmm. So, the people who are more likely to die from heat are the most vulnerable within our society.
I think you touched on this a little earlier, but without this data for heat-related deaths, what are we missing out on as it relates to intervention?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to describe a counterfactual, right? But
yeah.
I think what people were telling me is that, you have the state, you have cities, you have a lot of community groups who are really paying attention to heat now in a way that we hadn't in the past, and really recognizing that heat is a danger. And people are trying to do lots of different things. Some are longer-term solutions, right? Like planting more trees or finding ways to reduce the urban heat island effect. But some interventions are really immediate and quick. If you knew, for instance, that you had an area of the city of Boston, for instance, where a lot of people were dying from heat and you knew that they didn't have air conditioning units, you could target that. You could say, let's just give away 1,000 air conditioning units. Mm-hmm. That might help. Mm-hmm. If you knew that the population of people who were dying from heat the most in another area were outdoor workers, you might take a look at what sorts of policies are in place to make sure that people have access to cooling or have access to water, adequate breaks, right? Like if you know who is dying and where, you can target interventions in a way that you can't really right now. And you can also, importantly, you can know if what you're doing is working.
Got it. Well, with that said, Miriam, thank you so much for this reporting and taking it upon yourself to get to the bottom of this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on to talk about it.
That's WBUR Senior Climate and Environment Reporter Miriam Wasser. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. And thank you to everybody who left a rating or a review. We really appreciate it. It helps us out a lot. And please keep them coming, especially if you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify. Also, if you want to get in touch with us, hit us up on Instagram at WBUR The Common, or send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.